What are the dangers of making violence and disaster spectacular? I think, well, there's quite a few dangers, but I think first of all, what happens is I think it can make us feel hopeless a little bit. You know, we might look at a situation and we think, I think climate change, for instance, is a really good example of that, that we see this, you know, the last polar bear or the melting ice caps, and we think, what can we do about that in our village, you know, where we live? Or so I think that's the first thing for me. I think it can form a kind of malaise for people. They throw their hands in the air and they say, well, what can I do? And also I think it's just one frame of something. Because we see the explosion, or we see, you know, war reportage is a good example of that, that you see areas that have been bombed, and in your mind you believe that that is the whole of that country, or that is the existence for that country. So you know, that as viewers, as spectators from the outside of that, I think that's how we might end up seeing something. So that's a failure of representation, but also it gives us the idea sometimes, I mentioned Chernobyl earlier, the explosion at Chernobyl, that I think most people have the idea that that happened in the 80s and that was the end of it after a period of time, but it's not, because people still live with that disaster in their body. So children are born with cancer, and people are still experiencing the effects of that. So again, the danger is that we sort of parcel the disaster and say, well, that happened then and that's it, it's finished. So we don't really learn much from that. We don't understand really the continuum of these things, and therefore we keep repeating the same things. We have a film in the Disasters of Peace programme, Polish filmmaker Chapla, and his work, Paper Box, it looks at the destruction of photographs that were a family archive of photographs that disintegrated, and the reason that they disintegrated in water is because Poland had severe flooding recently. So this sort of small story of the destruction of a family photo album talks to much bigger themes around you know, why we're getting more flooding, you know, how did this event happen, but it's not preaching something to us. So I think that's a good example. Also, Gabriela Golda, her work was in an earlier program that we did, and she was looking at the destruction of a village through wildfires, and the reason that there were wildfires in this area is because it's a poor community built in this area that's prone to wildfires, and that relates to how we have to move in relation to sort of climate change. So slow violence, how do you represent it in a myriad of ways? But I think that what we are doing in our programme is actually looking at the personal stories and how these things unfold on a quite local level for people. How do I work with duration and the element of time in my work? Well, the work that I'm showing here is a slightly unusual film for me, because normally I work in terms of a more in a more interior way, and looking at psychological states. And the film that's in the programme here, To Be Here, is looking at the prolonged refugee crisis of the Sahrawi people, and they've been displaced for over 40 years now. It's coming on for 50 years actually. So yeah, how do you evoke that through a film? My original idea was slightly different, but actually that prolonged displacement in the end seemed to me the slow violence of the long effect of the war that they fled from in the first place, and part of the hardship of that displacement is boredom for the people there. Before I made the film, and before I went to the camps and made the film, I had a kind of preconceived idea that the hardship for people would be things like where do you get water from, and where do you get food, and that kind of thing, and that isn't necessarily a straightforward thing for people there, but I don't think people would describe that as their main point of suffering. The main issue for people is this uncertainty about future, and for some people, especially the younger people, it's the lack of a vision of the future. So the idea of boredom, I think, in the film, it speaks to that idea of this long drawn out situation that doesn't resolve. It's a liminal space, I think, and I often talk about the idea of suspended trauma in my work, and definitely for the Sahrawi people, they are living this suspended trauma, and that for a lot of people there, the days do not change because they're waiting for a resolution. So that's in the end what I focused on in that work, just very, very simple things, but the idea of just not much happening actually in the work.